Good evening. I'm Asmita Bakshi, and on behalf of Indus Syndicate and IIC, I welcome you all to the third Indus Conversation. India International Center has helped us organize this talk by hosting it, so thank you, IIC. This is the third Indus Conversation, which has been brought to you by Indus Syndicate, that aims to give a platform to progressive voices to help shape a progressive India. In the first edition, Professor Ian Woolford was in conversation with film writer and lyricist Varun Grover, where they talked to each other about Hindi and its evolving relationship with the world. In the second edition, we had Magsaysay Award winners T.M. Krishna and Bezwara Wilson, who were in conversation with Nilanjana Roy, where they talked about equality and social justice. Today, we are here to listen to two intellectuals whose works help us understand the country we are living in and whose depth of knowledge helps us broaden our own horizons. Here is a brief introduction of our speakers today. Mukul Kesavan teaches colonial Indian history at the Jamia Millia Islamia. He is interested in the nationalisms that shaped India in the 19th and 20th centuries. He wrote a tract called Secular Common Sense midway through the first NDA government, which examined the past and present of political pluralism in modern India. He is currently writing a book about the inclusive and eccentrically original nationalism that constituted the young republic and its prospect in majoritarian times. Kesavan is a columnist for The Telegraph Kolkata, where he writes on politics and current affairs. Joining him in the conversation today is Srinath Raghavan. Srinath is a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. He started his career in the Indian Army as an officer and later moved to the field of academics and took an MA and PhD at the King's College London, where his preferred field of study was war history. At CPR and King's College, he has worked on contemporary and historical aspects of Indian foreign policy and security policies. His written works include War and Peace in Modern India, a strategic history of the Nehru years, 1971, a global history of the creation of Bangladesh, and India's War, the making of modern South Asia, 1939 to 45. Srinath also regularly contributes to newspapers as a columnist, commenting on matters of national security and foreign policy. His insights with strong grounding in history help us use historical events and trends to understand present-day choices. This evening, Mukul and Srinath will be talking about nationalism. They will help us understand its significance and evolution in the Indian context and why it is important for us to revisit its meaning and history to help us navigate the present political environment in India. We would request you all to please put your mobile phones on silent mode or entirely switch them off so that it doesn't disturb the conversation. And we will open the talk for audience questions after the conversation is over. I will now hand over the stage to Mukul Kesavan and Srinath Raghavan.
You want to go first? Yeah? Yeah. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for being here today. Mukul, before you help us out with nationalism, help us out. Why are we talking nationalism today? I mean, Indian nationalism has got to be the oldest subject ever since the Indian nation has been around. People were talking about it even while the nation was coming into being. So why, choose a Saturday evening to talk about nationalism?
Yeah, especially when the talk schedule for the Saturday evening has this enormous, hugely informative title which just says nationalism. I think there's a reason for this. We don't have to pretend not to notice the elephant in the room. The past year has seen nationalism of a particular sort in the ascendant all over the world. And while we could argue about whether everything that's happened in England or America or in a sense, might happen in France or has happened earlier in Turkey or Russia, whether they're the same phenomenon, we can certainly see that there is a certain enthronement of a particular form of nationalism. And as Desis, we have the privilege of being slightly smug about this because we got here 3 years ago in 2014. So in a sense, we anticipated much of what has happened since. I think that's the reason we are here.
Okay, so let's just skin the cat a little bit, right? So nationalism. So one way of thinking about nationalism is, to say what the great Czech nationalist Jan Masaryk used to say, which is that nationalism is a ideology which says that the nation is the highest political value. And if you look back as a historian at Indian nationalism, it seems to me that the peculiar thing about Indian nationalism is that most Indian nationalists insisted that the nation was not the highest political value. So in that sense, is there something different? I hesitate to use the word exceptional because all nationalisms believe they are exceptional, but was there something fundamentally different about Indian nationalism?
As you say, all nationalisms claim to be exceptional and unique and peculiarly interesting. But what you say about great Indians who were engaged within public affairs and nationalism not valorizing the nation state or worshipping it is absolutely true. I mean, the greatest example, of course, is Tagore in that celebrated argument that he has with Gandhi about the nature of nationalism and his skepticism about it. But I think I want to say that since we were introduced and it was said that this is a platform for progressive people to think about the world, if I'm allowed broadly to think of progressives as all of us who are on the side of the angels versus everybody who isn't, I think one of the problems, it seemed to me, with the last year or the 2-3 years before that, has been that liberals and progressives often tend to be horrified by eruptions of nationalism such as this, which is perfectly reasonable. But I think what is less reasonable, and what is, I think, a mistake, is to evacuate the ground of nationalism. There is a sense in which all of us here who work within the context of the nation state, unless we are revolutionaries, are stuck with the nation state. There is no exit. So if you respond to an unlovely form of nationalism with horror, that's reasonable. But if you proceed to surrender the term and all that it means, all that it variously means, then I think you're making a mistake by handing crucial ground, in a sense, the mainstream of the politics of the nation state over to the other side. And I think it's particularly a mistake in the context of India. This comes back to your point about whether there's something peculiarly interesting about Indian nationalism. And I think there is. I think I can say with some historical detachment that to hold nationalism fastidiously at arm's length in a country like India is to misunderstand the nationalism that constituted the republic, that gave us our constitution, that in a sense shaped the republic in its early decades. Because it was, in fact, both a benevolent, eccentric, and remarkably novel nationalism. So I think if we as liberals are trying to respond to the world around us, and if we are trying to engage with the nationalisms that we feel beleaguered by, perhaps it's a good idea to ride a nationalism that is healthy and available and is tried and tested, which was, and to a considerable extent is, how Indians think of the mainstream of what we describe as nationalism. I mean, I would argue that anti-colonial nationalism of the sort sponsored by the Indian National Congress of blessed memory of colonial times is in fact interesting because it does something which is unique in the annals of the 19th century, which is, of course, the great century for nationalism. If you think of the early 1870s when Germany and Italy are constituted into nations, if you think of the rhetoric of nationalism of that time, if you think of the great figures who are valorized in India, Mazzini and Garibaldi and Cavour and Bismarck, and then if you look at the National Congress, which is established in 1885, and if you look at the nationalism that it literally invents, the difference between what passes as European nationalism, which is the default mode of nationalism, and what the Indian National Congress makes of it is extraordinary. The Congress literally inverts what nationalism means. I mean, normally speaking, nationalism as understood in the European context, and there are many kinds of European contexts, but broadly I think it'd be reasonable to say that a nation is seen as a home for a homogeneous people. The idea is that you are a people with a capital P, that you are unique because you're a people in a particular way, either on account of language or religion or blood or soil or essence or something to that effect. And you need a home, you need self-determination. And what is interesting is that the colonial context, and I think it's very important to remember that we were formerly colonized, that the colonial context of Indian nationalism creates a set of circumstances which the Indian National Congress and people who form it respond to with a strange mixture of opportunism, calculation, idealism, and improvisation. So you have, you have in 1885, stop me if I go on too much. You have in 1885 a bunch of people who essentially meet once a year. They have no secretariat, they mobilize nobody, they meet and pass resolutions once a year. And the colonial state actually understands the significance of this body well before the Congress itself does. There's an interesting redundancy built into the name of the Congress. It's the Indian, and just in case you'd missed the point, National Congress. And the third term is important as well. I mean, it's a Congress in the sense that it thinks of itself as a kind of proto-assembly. But it has no right to think of itself as a proto-assembly. It's a bunch of privileged, educated, often mainly Anglophone people who gather once a year. And it's faced with a potentially hostile colonial state which completely controls the country, and a subcontinental nation state in the making. I mean, the Congress, with just remarkable hubris, claims that all of British India is potentially a nation in the making. And I think what's interesting is how it does this. How do you demonstrate that you represent the Indian people when you represent nobody at all, when you're a bunch of lawyers and landholders and people who are principally urban? The Congress does just a wonderful sleight of hand. It says that we represent India because we represent within our ranks its diversity. Literally within our membership, its diversity. Now, this diversity is not reckoned in a kind of horizontal way, not in terms of class, because obviously the Congress of that time doesn't represent anybody who's remotely subaltern. What they do cleverly is that they invoke a kind of census diversity, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, people who speak Tamil and Kannada, and that there is a kind of diversity that we represent, that if India is a kind of wilderness, a kind of jungle of people, the Congress is a zoo which hosts each one of the human species that make up India. And just think about this. You're actually saying that we speak for the nation because we literally embody its diversity. Nobody within the history of nationalism has ever entered a claim as extraordinary as this.
Sure, but that claim was pretty hotly contested, right? I mean, there were many animals in the zoo who desperately wanted to get out and say that, we'd rather find another zoo for ourselves than being part of the zoo which is run by the Congress. And that in many ways is also the interesting thing about Indian nationalism, is that, it's the attempt to make it a unitary nationalism, even of the most progressive variety, was never a complete project. I mean, it was constantly challenged. It was challenged along the axes of sort of region, religion, caste. I mean, think of someone like Ambedkar, for instance, right? I mean, he never presumed that the Congress Party could speak for, the so-called backward classes.
Or Phule with the sort of earlier.
So
and the Muslim League.
Precisely. So in what sense then, is it useful to think about that sort of a Congress carrying on into the independent India period, at the Republican sort of moment?
Let me say that's a great question. It goes to the heart of the matter. I don't think the nationalism sponsored by the Congress is interesting because it's comprehensive or because it deals adequately with the diversity of, it's an umbrella organization, but no umbrella could be large enough to encompass India. And there was enormous contestation, as you point out. I think it's interesting because not only does it make this eccentric move of saying that we represent the nation because we represent its diversity, it also finds a non-denominational way of being patriotic. In the sense that one of the things that the Congress is very careful about is that, unlike other nationalisms, it can't invoke, an invented history or the notion of a people or an essence or a faith, because it recognizes that these things are potentially divisive and are likely to turn off as many people as they are to attract. There are other nationalisms that chose to do this. Even within the Congress, there were congressmen who chose to broadly invoke what they thought of as a liberal Hindu broadly nationalism. But I think the really remarkable move the Congress makes in the last decade of the 19th century is that it produces these great economic critiques of the colonial state, R.C. Dutt, Nauroji. And essentially, this critique of colonialism, of the colonial state as something that equally exploits every section of Indian society. I mean, it's a rhetorical argument. But the Congress actually follows through on it. It passes resolutions religiously about the working class, about the peasants, about tariffs, about revenues. The idea is that every nationalism has to have a grievance. The grievance must not be culturalist or religious. The grievance must, in a sense, be that we are exploited by the colonial state, which doesn't allow us to achieve our full potential. So all of us, regardless of whether we are Parsi industrialist or a talukdar in UP or a peasant or a worker, all of us, this whole principle contradiction thing, this idea that the main enemy is the colonial state. And this may not even have been seen as true and was contested by many, especially people like Phule, people like Ambedkar. But what is interesting is the way in which you invent. I think the economic critique is more valuable, not in terms of whether it's true or not, but as a rhetorical strategy for being nationalist in, if you will, a secular or not. It supplies secular grievance, which is interesting, I think.
Yeah, sure. But once the colonial is gone off the anti-colonial, what then sort of keeps this going, right? I mean, why is what is exactly the sort of continuity or not at the moment of?
Well, two things. One, what you're saying is absolutely true. Because this nationalism projects the colonial state as the principal glue that holds this enormously diverse subcontinent together. And I just want us to think about the size of this subcontinent. Undivided India was the size of Russia, of Europe without Russia. It's a gigantic area. It's a subcontinent. What you're trying to create is essentially a kind of subcontinental nationalism. And people keep praising India for its diversity. Well, the truth of the matter is the reason India is valorized for its diversity and Indian nationalism is valorized for its pluralism is not because it is by orders of magnitude more various than, say Europe. I mean, Europe is pretty various. The difference is that nobody has attempted to bind Europe together in one nation state. The diversity of Indian nationalism is because its ambitions are geographically so enormous. And, I think when it comes to what happened to this nationalism once the colonial state left, it's true, it had a kind of sell-by date. But the importance of this is that it has enough momentum left, despite partition, which is an enormous defeat. It has enough momentum left to actually create, in the midst of genocide in the early years, in the early months, a constitution which is so scrupulously liberal and secular that if it were to be written today, it would be pilloried as excessively politically correct. I mean, it builds affirmative action into it, it has universal adult franchise. So I think it's great achievement, regardless of its many lacunae, regardless of its upper casteness, regardless of its blindness, its hubris. Its great achievement is to create, against the odds, this extraordinary constitutional republic.
Sure, but I mean, looking back from 2017, right? I mean, I think as striking as this vision of the constitutional republic is, I think we also have to begin, and in many ways, the starting point really has to be an acknowledgement that somewhere in the late 50s, early 60s, that particular project ran out of steam, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's important to sort of maybe try and ask ourselves why that particular vision.
So what would you say? What do you think is if what is the moment of letdown? When does the Republican project, or when does the nation state constituted or the republic constituted by this nationalism begin to show its absences?
Well, I'd imagine that, in many ways, this kind of a unitary anti-colonial nationalism and the vessel which carries it, which being the Congress party, once it becomes a party in power, then the dynamic changes entirely, right? Because what you then have is fundamentally an upper caste political party, which is broadly Hindu, and which is using the sort of caste oligarchy in order to get votes delivered up from the bottom. And at some point, when other groups who are, the so-called sort of dominant peasantry and other backward classes and so on, understand that the Congress does not have much to sort of give them any longer, That's the moment from the mid-60s that you see, the decline of the Congress really beginning in a longer term. And I think the key there is to sort of ask ourselves, why did the Congress not do things that even conservative governments in Asia were doing at the same time, right?
Yes.
And I think of, say, a country like Japan, which, if ever there was an oligarchy, was exemplified by post-war Japan, right? Run by a bunch of highly right-wing nationalist oligarchs, right? But a country like Japan or a country like Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek, right, another oligarch, managed to push through land reforms of a kind that seemed so distant in Nehru in India. The other day I was looking at these papers written by a chap called Wolf Ladahinsky. So Wolf Ladahinsky is a sort of main advisor to General Douglas MacArthur, right? So you can think of, if as reactionaries goes, Douglas MacArthur is right there.
Right there.
And Wolf Ladahinsky had advised MacArthur on the sort of land reform projects in Japan. And their main concern, of course, was that if you did not do those reforms, in some ways you would sort of, be creating the ground for communists and others to kind of, embed themselves. And funnily enough, I think now that, India being non-aligned was the problem, because you never thought that you faced those kinds of pressures. So when the Americans, of all people, people like Wolf Ladahinsky, Chester Bowles, are telling you that, listen, Jawaharlal Nehru, why don't you think about land reforms in a serious way? It just does not occur to the Congress party that they can want to take on.
What does non-alignment, you think, have to do with it?
Well, I mean, see, if you were in an anti-communist alliance with the United States, I think the threat of sort of communism would be taken a lot more seriously, right? I mean, here you have a Congress party, which exactly is because of the kind of middle and encompassing ground that it occupies, believed that it was immune to those kinds of challenges in any serious way. And because of the requirements of having this party to win democratic elections, and once again, right, I mean, it speaks to the kind of system that we adopted. If you want to have a universal adult franchise democracy in a country which is sort of so highly stratified by caste and power relations, and if the Congress party embodies and actually depends on those relations to deliver power to it, then yes, you do get 15 years of stable government, so to speak, but that stability is of a very misleading variety, right?
There's I remember in the 1970s, one of the great celebrated compendious surveys of democracy was that famous book by Barrington Moore Jr. And the chapter on India was called Democracy and the Price of Peaceful Change. I mean, and the point he made was that, precisely the point you're making, that there's some sense in which the Indian nation state in its infant years never feels the need or never dares to actually tackle the business of land reform, or something that I've never quite understood why it didn't happen, which is mass primary education. I mean, here you have Nehru, who you would imagine would be the pin-up boy for any notion of progressive primary education. You'd expect that, a kind of old-fashioned Fabian like him would, for him, this would be the first order of business. You have a mandate, you rule for 17 years, and you don't do universal primary education. Every Asian country, right, left, or center, does universal primary education. Why do you think?
Again, I think Indian nationalism is exceptional, right? And now exceptional in not so nice a way.
Yeah.
Because most other nationalisms thought of education as the main way of inculcating ideas about the nation, right? And again, because you had this idea that, we want to have a very different kind of nationalism, some of the older sort of techniques of, the sort of the dissemination of ideas about the nation were never quite taken seriously. I mean, in that sense, the nation-building project really became one about delivering on a certain kind of developmentalist model, which was high modernist, which had sort of technocratic visions of a certain kind, which were very alluring. So, so creating the IITs using American and West German and Russian help is seen as more important than paying attention to nuts and bolts of what's happening in a village school.
Is a more reductive explanation also possible that, as you said, the Indian National Congress in the 50s, after the great, the great task of winning freedom and constituting the republic is done, increasingly begins to become more and more visible as an upper caste organization. And Nehru, for all his virtues, perhaps was, in some essential way, a Kashmiri Brahmin in the end. And that this organization, despite its many well-meaning people, just couldn't empathize with people who weren't educated. The kind of, if you will, a Savarna blindness to the crucialness of a level playing field and the idea of self-improvement.
No, I think so. And that blindness extends to other fields as well, right? I mean, you take the example of, the iconic image of Indian anti-colonial nationalism, right? something like the Kheda Satyagraha. Who is the sort of nationalist there? It's a peasant nationalist, right? I mean, so that's the sort of model on which this nationalism is based. But by mid-1950s, by the time you come to the second five-year plan, that peasant is getting a pretty raw deal in terms of trade within your vision of the developmental state, right? I mean, which is why if you look at, say, someone like Charan Singh, who comes out of a certain kind of background, right? So Charan Singh is basically someone who came now remembered as somehow embodying Jat politics, but was never sort of a votary of Jat politics in a sort of caste sense at all, right? So Charan Singh's fundamental constitutive vision, which he drew from another stalwart leader of the Jats called Chotu Ram from Punjab, was basically that India is divided between rural and urban India, and that rural India is the real India, and its needs have to be given primacy. And it's in the late 50s that Charan Singh writes this famous pamphlet called Cooperative System X-Rayed, right? Where he says that what you're trying to do alongside this pell-mell industrialization that you want to do is to cut a very raw deal to the peasant nationalists, who are the sort of backbone of course, many of them are from the more dominant caste, so to speak. But nevertheless, that lot never gets its voice. So which is why, from 1967, the decline of the Congress is really about people like Charan Singh peeling off, right? And then finding other ways of getting their vision across, right? And that did have a certain kind of valency. You take someone like young Mulayam Singh Yadav, first time MLA in 1967, a protege of Charan Singh, who sort of came into politics as part of something known as the canal rate agitation in UP in the 1950s, right? So those kinds of politics were quite important. And I think the Nehruvian sort of vision and the state, and its sort of version of nationalism, in some ways did not have much of a space at all for these people.
So do these alternative modes of politics and these alternate visions of what the nation building project consists of, different emphases on rural and urban and so on, are these in a sense constructed out of the breadth of the Congress project, or are they something different altogether? I mean, when do we see the momentum of the kind of nation-building vision that the Congress carried into the first decade of independence? When do we see that, in a sense, flag and be gradually delegitimized?
I'd imagine, the mid-1960s are really the turning point in that sense, right? I mean, because that is when the particular kind of Congress party, which in some ways is not actually the legacy of Jawaharlal Nehru, but the legacy of Sardar Patel, right? He was the Congress sort of boss. The machinery which he created, which is of saying that regional satraps would be the main sort of force which would aggregate votes and send it up, and that you had the regional Pradesh Congress committees and such like things. That model starts creaking by the mid-1960s, which is why then when come 1967, Indira Gandhi is able to break that oligarchy pretty quickly, right? I mean, all the regional satraps are sidelined very quickly. And I think the reason that is happening is not just internal to the Congress, but also because of these external forces. I mean, think of a state like Tamil Nadu, right? I mean, 1967 is the first time that the Congress is booted out of Tamil Nadu, and never really managed ever to sort of come back into power into that state, right? And then the sort of the scale of the defeat which the Congress suffered then meant that it practically had to vacate a certain kind of space, which was now taken up by an entirely different party. And remember that the Congress party at that time in Tamil Nadu was not an upper caste party. It had Kamaraj Nadar as the sort of,
That's right.
this thing, right? I mean, so in a sense, the Congress, it was not like it was trying to not adapt to a certain situation. But the fact was that these other visions of what the Tamil nation should be, or, and even that mutated, right? So there is a Periyar vision of the Dravidians versus the Aryans. But under the sort of DMK and Karunanidhi and Annadurai, it becomes more of a sort of a language-based Tamil identity. It's not a Dravidian identity, but a Tamil identity. But whatever mutation it takes, it is strong enough to displace the Congress in such a way that it's never able to come back into power.
I just, since we were talking about regions, I just want to briefly backpedal and maybe discuss one of Republican nationalism's great successes. I mean, this eclectic, pluralist sort of nationalism, which is essentially a form of an improvised response to India's diversity. We were talking about this. I think that one of the great improvised triumphs of the early republic is the linguistic states, and not because there was some Congress genius who decided this is how it would be done, because Nehru was actually quite reluctant to go down that route. But I think what's interesting is that even with a nationalism like the Congress's, which is committed to a kind of diversity, there's a kind of compelling force to the idea of a national language. You know, the idea that if you're going to have a new nation state, you should have a national language. And what follows is, I think, just a remarkable example of the back and forth, the improvisation, the opportunism, and the ability to absorb all of this. That was one of the strengths of this kind of nationalist vision, that you first say that we'll have Hindustani in the Persian and the Nagri script. The moment partition happened, you sort of turn around and say, okay, we don't need it in the Persian script anymore because the bulk of the Muslims have gone, so we will have Hindi in Nagri. And then because non-Hindi speaking states aren't very happy, you say that for 10 years you will have English as well as a linked language. And as opposed to Hindiwalas who are constantly telling us that we should speak the Rashtra Bhasha, of course, the truth is that every Indian language that is officially organized is a national language. So there's that to, in a sense, appease people who are not Hindiwalas. And then the non-Hindi speaking states are allowed to correspond with the center in English. And what's interesting is the question of a national language is raised, it's contested. Is this a solution? No, of course it isn't a solution. It's procrastination. It's punting the ball ahead and hoping that the future will take care of it. And one of the important things about this kind of nationalism is that it recognizes that there are some problems posed by diversity that can't be neatly resolved. That, the best way of doing it is often to postpone them, to let hot button issues just grow cold. And this is something that nationalism does well, but it doesn't do many other things well. And you were saying that one of the things that begins to happen to the Congress in the mid-60s is the secession of people like Mulayam Singh Yadav, the taking over of Tamil Nadu by a completely different political party. Does this, in a sense, is this symptomatic of some larger sociological change that's occurring?
Well, I think it is, right? Because, to the extent that you had any kind of, development in India, especially in rural India, it was the sort of dominant peasant communities which benefited from those. And those were the communities which then became more assertive about the kinds of political claims that they wanted to make. Because, ironically, when Indira Gandhi comes in and does the Green Revolution, these groups are the major beneficiaries of that as well, right? Particularly in the Punjab, Western UP and other places. It is actually the groups which are opposed to the Congress which benefit most from the Green Revolution and then go on to then finish the Congress there entirely, right? I mean, so in a sense, you cannot sort of get it right both ways. But while you were talking about, linguistic states and so on, I thought the other kind of, remarkable sort of piece of constitutional experimentation which happened in the early years, which today is very ironical to even mention in this context, is, of course, the state of Jammu and Kashmir.
Yes.
Right? I mean, if you think about what Article 370 was, Article 370 was effectively an attempt to tell the people of Kashmir that we want you so badly that we will allow you to have your own terms to decide how you want to be part of the state, right? So which is why you had accession is restricted only to three things. Kashmir is the only state of India which has its own constitution and so on, right? I mean, even as a constitutional vision, it demonstrated a degree of suppleness. And of course, we got the politics entirely wrong, particularly from 1953 onwards when Sheikh
You could argue that it was done in bad faith.
It was, well, I don't think
No,
it was done. I mean, see, and I think it's also important to understand from the other side, right? I mean, we constantly think about it from the side of saying, oh, okay, how did we do it? Why did Sheikh Abdullah want that kind of a vision? Partly because, Sheikh Abdullah wanted to implement a socio-economic program called the Naya Kashmir Agenda, which was far more progressive than any land reform or any other kind of sort of egalitarian project which was being done anywhere, right? So funnily enough, these projects were, tried at their most in Kashmir and in Kerala, right? I mean, in that sense, it's the non-Congress parts of India which really managed to try that experiment. And I find it quite ironic that today, and since this is a conversation about today as much as the past, there are highly sensible people, who have law degrees and who have made their careers as sort of lawyers and so on, who call for the abrogation of Article 370, which suggests that they've not even read that article very carefully. Because the first thing Article 370 says is that Article 1 of the Constitution applies to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, what is Article 1? Article 1 basically says what are the various geographic constituents of the Union of India. Now, what it means is that if you abrogate Article 370, Article 1 stops applying to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which would mean that Kashmir would become independent. Now, it was actually done because when Article 370 was being made, we had given a pledge for a plebiscite, right? So the idea was that if at all we have to let go of the state, there has to be a constitutional mechanism to do it. So today, the people who believe that they can actually sort of enforce the integration of Kashmir into the Union of India by abrogating Article 370.
We'll do the reverse.
I think they have the faintest clue of what's going to happen. You know, somebody could move the International Court of Justice, and believe me, just on the reading of the Constituent Assembly debates and of the Indian Constitution, you know, the case is a knockout one, and I really hope people sort of understand the ramifications of what they're advocating for.
Talking about the fact that Kashmir had a special constitutional status, it's interesting and quite remarkable that till the China War, secession was not a treasonable demand. Wasn't the DMK formally committed at some point to an independent Tamil state?
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about this early vision is, as Srinath was saying, is its suppleness and its willingness to recognize that one size does not fit everyone. That this is a subcontinent, you're trying to create a subcontinental nation state, that you have to allow for difference. You have to allow for difference without fetishizing the uniformities that a republic often tries to impose upon its people. So when does it radically go wrong?
Well, I mean, I think instead of asking when does it radically go wrong, it might also be useful to ask when do others start really sort of coming into the center stage, right? And I think we should sort of talk about the other elephant in the room, which is about Hindu nationalism, right? Which is around from pretty much the time that various strands of Indian nationalism start coming into being.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that that there is a majoritarian nationalism which is represented by extraordinary men within the Congress as well.
Exactly.
I mean, for example, you could argue, and many people have, that the extremists led by Lal Balpal did in fact represent what can be broadly described as a generous majoritarianism, which nonetheless insisted that the essence of the Indian state was in some broad sense Hindu. I mean, it's also interesting that there's this emphasis on culture, this emphasis that there's some sense the culture of the predominant demographic group ought to be acknowledged as a reasonable ground for nationalist solidarity. And it always exists, but I think it's within the Congress, it's a subterranean, or shall we say, not the dominant position.
Well, I mean, there was a moment when it could have become dominant, right? I mean, when that's the sort of iconic Purushottam Das Tandon versus Jawaharlal Nehru thing. Because, see, that struggle is happening within the Congress immediately ahead of the first general elections, when which the Congress and Nehru want to treat as a referendum both on the Constitution, which was never put to vote, but also as an affirmation of a secular India versus this thing. And to do it in UP, which was, of course, one of the most, as you know better than I do, sort of most strongly affected by partition, was to affirm a certain identity for the nation, right? So in that sense, there was a very strong, time when those things happened.
And the UP Congress was, in fact, very often its leadership seemed as much out of the Hindu Mahasabha as it did out of the Congress.
Right? And frankly, those memberships were permeable until sort of
39.
and even later, right? I mean, so then after Gandhi's assassination, Patel kind of made it clear that this kind of dual membership has to cease, and those boundaries were very porous. There was no such sort of clear dividing line, and as late as 1964, around the time when Jawaharlal Nehru dies. There's this communal riots in India which are sparked off by the theft of the Prophet's relic hair, the relic Muay Muqaddas in Hazrat Bal. And Nehru's sort of final set of warnings really are to say that, listen, I mean, this is a country where, people like me have fought Muslim communalism for a very long time. And I'll say that going forward, Hindu communalism has to be the main thing that you guys have to watch out for, right? Because the Hindus are a majority in this country. There is no denying that. But I think, by the time you're talking about 15 years of a certain Nehruvian vision, there are other more possibly aspects of Congress nationalism. Gandhi's ideas of religion, for instance, which are completely discarded, right? I mean that vision to say that we have to work through religion rather than against it, or to pretend that religion does not matter to most people, that it does not form part of people's sort of cultural common sense, was one that the Nehruvian state again never gave much attempt to, and then was seen as somehow a very retrogressive vision, right? So in that sense, I think. By the time you're coming to the mid-1970s with, another sort of national movement coming up against the Indira Gandhi government and the emergency and so on, you have the Hindu right and the RSS sort of very much at the forefront of that particular...
You had an interesting point to make about why the Hindu right gets a remarkable fillip in the middle of the 70s. Do you want to just expand on that?
okay, think about it this way, right? I mean, when the sort of Navnirman movement, which Jayaprakash Narayan is kind of putting together, JP is out of politics for a very long time, right? In terms of formal politics, comes back in. And almost from the very outset, and you can read letters written to JP at Nehru Memorial Library, people are warning him saying that, the stormtroopers of this movement are people from the RSS. And JP says, listen, I know that, but the greater enemy today is Indira Gandhi. So in a sense, it's a bit like the anti-colonial thing, right? I mean, so at that time, the Congress's mantra used to be that everyone has to get together because we need to fight so and so. A similar kind of a dynamic develops. And what it means is that it gives the RSS and the Hindu right a kind of political legitimacy that they have never managed to get ever since the assassination of Gandhi, right? Because if you look at key figures in the, both in the Janasangh of the 1950s and 60s, people like, especially the post-Shyama Prasad Mukherjee phase, if you think about Deen Dayal Upadhyay, Atal Bihari Vajpayee. See, these were figures who had to function in politics against the tide, as it were, right? I mean, it's no surprise that someone like Atal Bihari Vajpayee emerges as this figure who's able to speak to people across the aisles and so on. Because if you did anything other than that, your survival was very much in question, right? I mean, you're a very small force. You had to expand very carefully. And, people like Deen Dayal Upadhyay are already in the late 1950s thinking about expanding the Janasangh's sort of presence into the tribal areas, for instance. And even presences as a sort of an environmental movement, among law letter in some ways. And so you have to do a range of things. You have to tie up with the socialists with whom you have absolutely nothing in common in the by-elections of 1963 in order to sort of say that, we can capitalize on the moment of weakness of the Congress party after the China War, right? So all of that, and then the Samyukta Dayak Dal coalition governments of 1967. So in 1975, and then the 77 elections really are, the moment when they come into the mainstream of politics and are seen as an acceptable political force. The ideology which they espouse may or may not have been very different from what Savarkar was saying in the thing. But the political forms in which they had to sort of give expression to that ideology had become quite different. And I think, that in some ways is the real trigger for this thing. So in a sense, the longer term consequences of the imposition of the emergency really are to give a fillip to the Hindu right in terms of mainstream politics.
One of the interesting things about someone of my generation, living through the controversies that occur periodically about nationalist symbols, is the remarkable irony of it that that the Tiranga, which was in every sense a Congress flag, it's essentially adapted from the Congress flag. You remove the charkha and you stick the Ashok Chakra in. The Tiranga used to be a flag of contention. Certainly Hindu nationalists did not embrace this. There was the Bhagwa Dhwaj, which was the saffron standard, which was the emblem of Hindu nationalism. There was a sense in which it's the tricolor's Congress affiliations were offensive to people who wished to produce a different nationalism. The national anthem. One of the curious things about the controversy about the national anthem is I find it hard to feel worked up about it because right through my childhood into the time when I went to college, at the end of every movie I can remember seeing anywhere, in Regal, in Odeon, in Plaza, there would be the Tiranga projected on the screen and the national anthem would play and you would get up and, some people would shift around. But you'd get up and, you did it reflexively. It was neither seen as a hectoring nationalism. It was like, it was what you did. You went, saw a movie, you got up, you stood still for the length of the anthem and you went. And what is interesting is the extraordinary success of the Hindu right in appropriating these symbols for a completely different nationalism. I mean, there's a sense in which when Professor, who's the physics professor? I'm forgetting my name. No, Murli Manohar Joshi, when he led that thing to Kashmir about the flag, and I thought, the gall of it. I mean, you lot wouldn't even have anything to do with the tricolour a couple of decades ago, and now you're scurrying around the Kashmir Valley to try and teach, Kashmiris the value of a national emblem. But I think the interesting thing is that the anthem, the flag, and the selective poaching of the nationalist pantheon. I mean, really speaking, the Sangh Parivar is this curious nationalist organization without an anti-colonial past. So, there is a sense in which you have to scavenge a bunch of nationalist ancestors. But you have to give them credit for doing this and the success with which they did this. I mean, to be, within the internecine arguments within, broadly speaking, Congress nationalism, to happily trade away, iconic figures within you and hand them over to the right. And for the right to have the vision to actually see, I mean, for Mr. Modi to valorize Patel is literally to steal one of the great triumvirate, at the end of the 40s in India. So what seems to me interesting is that not only is the Janasangh and then the Bharatiya Janata Party, in a sense, rehabilitated by the emergency, they acquire a kind of heroic past where they have resisted quite rightly, and to their credit, when they did, an authoritarian regime. It also allows them, in a sense, a breathing space in which to enlarge and widen the scope of what was really a Hindustan type nationalism, a narrow North Indian parochial Hindu nationalism, to actually broaden it both retrospectively and broaden it in terms of who they are pitching it to. As you mentioned, they're expanding even in the 60s to tribal communities, etc.
Yeah, no, and I think the seriousness of that entire project should not be sort of dismissed. Right?
No,
I mean,
absolutely.
I think you have to give them full credit that they do have a clear set of ideology. It is mutated as all these things do over a period of time. They have, as you're saying, brought in new elements, but give credit where it is due. That they have managed to sort of keep their sort of ideological program quite tightly linked with their political program in a way that the Congress Party never could, right? I mean, even in its in the post-Nehruvian period, I mean, what is the sort of ideology that the Congress Party stands for? I mean, does it stand for secularism? Does it stand for democracy? I mean, in every count, it was seen as sort of weak, and in many ways, they were able to sort of play on it.
I think it's, at this point, it might be useful to sort of name check one thing, which is that when we discuss the transition of the Congress from its pomp into the 60s and the 70s and the emergency and after, I think it's useful to spend some time on the fact that one reason why this conception of the nation state and its interest is gradually delegitimized is precisely because the principal bearer of this idea, to the extent that it is an ideology, becomes effectively a dynastic party. I think it's important for us to recognize that the transition from Nehru to Shastri to Indira Gandhi is a momentous transition, that it increasingly, if we are talking about where did Congress ideology go, I think part of the reason why Congress ideology is either supremely populist and effective, as with Roti Kapda Aur Makan, or virtually absent in a kind of spectacular display of opportunism, Mrs. Gandhi patronizing everybody from Bhindranwale to the Shiv Sena. I think part of this has to do with the creation or the transformation of what is a benevolent umbrella political party into the instrument of a dynastic individual's will.
Absolutely, and an instrument of a dynastic individual's will, whittling down of a party organization which had been built up over decades very carefully, right? I mean, if you think about the Congress Party today, think what would the fortunes of the party have looked like if they had people like Mamata Banerjee or Sharad Pawar very much within the fold of the party rather than being outside it, right? But the fact is that the dynastic element was precisely that it's there. And in some ways, I actually do not believe that, that element can be sort of so easily done away with. Because if you look at practically every person who matters in Congress Party today, actually, broadly speaking, in Indian politics today, all of them were politicians who were sort of cradled during the emergency, right? I mean, if you just look at the last two sort of UPA cabinets, right? I mean, the who's who of the cabinet were people who came into the Congress Party as either youth Congress leaders or as people who came into the party during emergency, often under the leadership of Sanjay Gandhi, right? Including people like Pranab Mukherjee, who are now. They were proteges of that particular kind of turn towards a more dynastic mold, right? So in that sense, the particular shift that you're talking about is fundamental, right? It's not just cosmetic. It's not just about saying that, leadership is just being handed over. It's also that the rank and file are now being populated by people who owe something only to this particular leadership, who do not have anything of their own to offer. In that sense, it's a fundamental transformation. Whose importance I don't think can be sort of underestimated in this context.
Since we're talking about alternative visions of the nation, and we spoke about the Congress, of course, and we spoke about Hindu nationalism, its travails, its ascent, and so on. I had a question, which is that if you think of the late 1980s and the early 1990s as a political context, the political contest is often, at least in North India, between sort of Mandir and Mandal. Yeah. And if we look at Mandal more broadly as a metaphor rather than a specific legislation to do with largely to do with North India, the question I have is this: Hindu nationalism becomes, if you will, or Hindutva becomes a coherent pan-Indian political position. It becomes an alternative nationalism. On the other hand, you have this incredibly dynamic and politically often very successful political development, which consists of backward castes, of dominant agricultural communities, of Dalit-led Mayawati and BSP and Kanshiram, leading extraordinarily successful insurrections, if you will, in UP, achieving political power there. And we already have an older version of this in South India. I mean, North India is the laggard in this. This has already happened in the peninsula. Why is it that unlike Hindutvadi nationalism, this, if I can use the term for want of a better term, why does this broadly subaltern caste fraction-based politics, which has an alternative vision, not necessarily theorized systematically, but often theorized. I mean, Kanshiram, the Bahujan Samaj Party, the antecedents of Ambedkar and Phule. Why does this not become, if you will, an alternative pan-Indian project?
Well, I mean, you could say that someone like Mayawati attempted it for a brief period in UP in the 2000s, right? When you try and create some kind of a rainbow coalition and so on. But the problem, I think, was that, you were trapped in the same mode that allowed you to legitimize. In a sense, it's a replica of the Congress problem in the 1950s, right? What allows for successful electoral mobilization also poses limits on the political project, right? And that, I think, was the real problem. Because if you, again, it's very interesting to think about, the caste politics of UP in the 1990s, right? The ideological antecedents and political antecedents of that in the sort of socialist, Samajwadi kind of mold was not just about caste. I mean, whatever you may say about Ram Manohar Lohia, he was not just interested in sort of caste reservations. I mean, Lohia wanted reservation for women. He had an agenda of Hindi versus English. And he had an agenda of sort of, a very different kind of international outlook for India and so on, right? So it was not just a ossified caste-based mobilization. So in a sense, the Mandal moment was one of a crystallization of a political project, which turned out to be fundamentally about caste, in a way that its antecedents in the socialist movement were
not necessarily designed to...
It was not, right? And you at the other strand, as mentioning earlier, is Charan Singh and others, right? Which is, again, not just an OBC platform. I mean, that was not Charan Singh's idea. Charan Singh's idea was to create a much wider belt of non-sort of, Brahmin Thakur land sort of communities in North India. And that was another vision, which premised that the nation was fundamentally in rural India, right? I mean, and that nation had to get its priority, and he did try it for all it's worth, right? If you look at the 1979 budget, when he was finance minister, it is a budget which more or less is a radical departure from anything which was ever done because of the huge transfer of resources which happened towards rural communities. At that time it was decried as populism and so on, but he said, I am going to stand and sort of deliver this budget. Again, if you think about the 1980s, you had people like Mahinder Singh Tiket, who could sort of bring this city to an end. Standstill, right? Or the Shetkari Sanghatna with Sharad Joshi in Maharashtra, right? I mean, today in India, you have very clearly some considerable levels of distress in rural agrarian communities, right? Which is why you're seeing mobilization of Jats, seeing mobilization of dominant communities like Marathas and others, Patels, Patidars, right? But who is able to give political sort of voice to these? There's just no political party in the space, right? So in that sense, I think there are certain very strong strands of nationalism which were very different from that of the Congress, in a sense that they had a very different vision of what this nation has to stand for, which have been completely obscured.
So if you look at the BSP, it doesn't see itself, or it wasn't designed by Kanshiram to be a provincial party. They had ambitions in Madhya Pradesh, in Rajasthan, in Punjab, in Haryana.
That's right.
And they also had I remember going in the, I think, 1996 to cover the Faizabad election. And I went to the BSP office, and this man showed me a ball pen with a small top. He said that, we are not a Dalit party. We are a Bahujan Samaj party. It's just that right now you have a society like this, where the small cap of the pen dominates the rest. We want to merely invert it, and everybody should get their share. Why doesn't this project, say the BSP's project, in limited regional sense, succeed in transcending UP?
I mean, I think part of the problem is simply in terms of electoral sort of strength and so on, right? I mean, the kind of cohesion that you have in UP. And BSP also has a catchment within a certain section of the Dalit community, right? I mean, it's not like... So which is why, say, other groups like the BJP have from time to time tried to go to other sort of non-Tamar communities within the Dalits and try and sort of, woo them and so on. So I think, there are sort of limitations post-electorally by the sort of distribution of Dalits outside of UP and places like that. Maharashtra might have been the other sort of potential state, right? I mean, where things are. But there, the lockdown of the Marathas is such, and it's across parties, right? Is such that, Dalit politics never really took off. And to the extent that it's taken off, it's always been an ally to this or that kind of now highly majoritarian forms of politics, right?
So we seem to have a situation where you had the Congress, and now you have the BJP. You have the Congress as a kind of rump after the last elections. You have political parties that didn't see themselves as provincial, that saw themselves with larger ambitions, whether it's the left or whether it's say the BSP. But no political party, apart from the Congress or the BJP, succeeds in establishing, or no coalition of parties that are broadly sympathetic succeed in creating a kind of pan-Indian presence.
Well, I mean, the question is, whether you want to sort of look for alternatives only in a pan-Indian space,
okay.
right? And I think, going forward, frankly, I think it's the regional space which is going to be a lot more interesting in terms of what kind of politics we are crystallizing. And there, I think, right now we are at a moment of entry. You spoke earlier about Indian nationalism and the Republican state not being a one-size-fits-all kind of model. But with, say, something like the GST coming in, you are pretty much getting into a one-size-fits-all model for certain very important things. I mean, if I think about my state of Tamil Nadu, right? I mean, the kinds of things that, say, M.G. Ramachandran was able to do with universalization of the midday meal scheme would be impossible under a GST-like scheme.
Because you wouldn't have revenues.
You just can't raise revenues. There is an FRBM which says, there are limits to how much you can borrow. What do you do? Right? Which is precisely why the ADMK and Jayalalitha sort of fought tooth and nail against it in Parliament. Right? So I think the kinds of, political economy structures that we are now embracing will, going forward, create more avenues for sort of conflicts because regional aspirations, visions of development. Again, you said that South India has sort of been ahead in terms of backward caste politics, but South India is also very different backward caste politics, right? Because that politics has also relied on a degree of social mobilization which is quite extraordinary. Nothing of that sort has ever happened even after Mandal in North India. I mean, the degree of sort of the sense of entitlement that people have, the degree to which they know their rights and so on, and the willingness of both the DMK and the ADMK to deliver on a certain set of things, whatever else they may be doing or not, is, I think, a remarkable testimony to the levels of social mobilization which have happened there. So I think, those are the kinds of forces which cannot be sort of forgotten or sidelined, right? I mean, I think going forward, there's going to be a lot more churning along the sort of regional axis, along various kinds of visions of development about what certain states can and cannot do, what people want. And I think, instead of hankering after a unifying pan-Indian sort of nationalism of a certain kinds, we have to go back to at least one vision of the original sort of nationalism, which is accepting the diversity of these kinds of states, right? And that in some ways was Gandhi's great contribution to the Congress party, right? He said that, Pradesh Congress committees have to be based on linguistic stuff. And that, in some ways, the older administrative unity of India cannot be the basis on which we think about nationalism.
So if you're talking about, as you correctly point, instead of hankering after some great pan-Indian alternative miraculously emerging at our door that is going to, in a sense, rescue us from the clutches of right-wing nationalism, what would an interesting, progressive, nationalist politics do in the present moment? Let me link this to the eccentric example of the Aam Aadmi Party. I think what's interesting about the Aam Aadmi Party, despite its its leadership manias and its and the splendid cast of maverick characters that it has, is that the Aam Aadmi Party actually, I think one of the reasons why it was such an important force in Delhi was it actually did politics. I mean, after a long time, you actually had a political party which did politics in an unabashedly populist way, but tried to create an alternative form of populist politics centered on what they thought would strike a chord with the material aspirations of the people whose votes they were seeking. Their much touted Mohalla clinics, their experiments in education, both of which have been either critiqued as exaggerated or critiqued for their substance. But what's interesting is this is a party that is both doing this and marketing the fact that it's doing this. That there is a non-sectarian attempt, rather like the great achievements of the Dravid parties in Tamil Nadu, an attempt to produce a populist politics that responds to popular demand, if you will, creates a constituency and mobilizes people who then begin to expect the state to do things for them.
Yeah.
So I offer the Aam Aadmi Party as an example. Is this what a modern populism looks like?
Well, I mean, it can take many forms, and I think one of the sort of key things for any progressive nationalism or that kind of politics really has to be an acceptance that certain kinds of territory cannot be automatically ceded to the other side, as it were, right? And here I particularly think about things relating to sort of security, to the armed forces, and such like things. Because, historically, Hindu nationalism has a very ambivalent relationship with the Indian Army itself. The Indian Army was the instrument of the colonial power, right? So to that extent, everyone was uncomfortable. People like Savarkar were deeply uncomfortable with the Indian Army because it was disproportionately represented by the Muslims and the Sikhs. And to the extent that other groups came in, they tended to be Dalits and others, right? And while Savarkar was for and against untouchability, I mean, the fact that you have Dalits sort of coming in is a problem, right? So in that sense, but today, if you look at it, I mean, it's almost by default that people tend to assume that, anyone who is, capable of speaking for the armed forces and so on, automatically, has to sort of espouse a certain variety of majoritarian nationalism. I mean, why has that ground been ceded? Is something that is a bit mystifying to me, and I think
so. You were a soldier, and did you serve in Kashmir?
Yeah, I did serve in Kashmir. Yeah.
So one of the hardy perennials of Indian political discussion is AFSPA.
Sure.
So just using AFSPA as a peg, I just want you to reflect on whether whether liberals or progressives or people who are critical of a majoritarian nationalism, whether in your view they've just stopped thinking about this and merely by abdicating the ground have handed over both, if you will, the armed forces and any constituency that admires them to the other side.
Well, I mean, see, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act is a kind of an interesting particular thing, right? Because, see, there is a genuine problem with the Armed Forces Special Powers Act in as much as it licenses a certain degree of impunity. Because the assumption is that even if someone is, prima facie there is a case against, say, a fake encounter or something like that, cannot be sort of tried in a court of law until and unless the Armed Forces and the Ministry of Defense actually give clearance.
Which they never do.
But in most cases will not, and they might hold a court-martial of their own, which has happened in certain cases. But again, so that is what gives the sense of impunity to people, right? Because people believe that here is an institution which, instead of being the enforcer of the law, is somehow beyond the law, right? And that is a political problem. Now, the armed forces have a certain view as well, which is to say that if you are an Indian Army officer, I was posted in Doda district, let's assume I hypothetically went out on an operation, killed a couple of militants, bona fide people who are sort of gun-carrying terrorists, so to speak. And if an FIR was registered against me for murder or manslaughter in that thing, and if I was supposed to expected to sort of turn up in that court every time a summons was given against my name, the Indian Army cannot function at all, right? So you do need some legal protection to make sure that bona fide actions can continue without giving sort of leeway for malafide action to be sort of condoned, right? And that is the balance that I think, we have to strike. And that, I would imagine, is very much a liberal case, which is to say that, listen, the rule of law has to be applicable to everyone. We don't want rule of men, right? We want rule of law. And the way to think about it is that certain institutions need certain kinds of safeguards in order to carry out their legitimately constituted duty. And instead of that, if we have a single point agenda of saying that AFSPA has to be scrapped, and I think it should be scrapped. In fact, I think the army should demand the scrapping of the AFSPA, provided other safeguards are built into it, in other things. You can amend the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. There are other ways in which you can give them the right kind of cover. But there's no need to do this. And let's also not forget that the AFSPA was bought in by Jawaharlal Nehru, right? In the context of this thing. So
There was an ordinance before that, right?
well,
During
there
the
was an
Second World
ordinance
War.
during the Quit India movement, which incidentally never gave, which only authorized the use of force unto the point of killing to the rank of captain and above.
That's right. And now it's
we
covered
allow non-commissioned officers to do it, right? So in a sense, the colonial state was slightly more benevolent than we have.
So, do we?
I think we should.
I think we should. Yeah, yeah. So, not that this is a particularly tidy end, but on that note, Srinath, thank
Yeah,
you.
sure.
And it's open to the House. Yes, the gentleman there.
The negative aspects of nationalism can be shed if you think of it as a mobilizational factor, as a mobilizational force. In 1885, Congress was not a mobilizational force, but by 1915, when Gandhi came back second time from South Africa, it became a mobilizational fact. And it was a great help to the whole colonial movement generally. So nationalism is not necessarily a negative factor.
You'll get no argument from me about that. I mean, I agree with you.
After 47, it was not nationalism, but caste that became a mobilizational factor. And I think one of the conversations that Indus can take up is how dominant a factor that was vis-a-vis nationalism within India. Now, I think the problem with nationalism is the problem that has erupted after 2014. The right-wing nationalism, and that is frightening enough. But I think what is even more frightening is the non-inclusive nature of this nationalism. Now, this was true also when liberalization set in. I mean, when Congress came in 1991. But it was still pretending to be inclusive. Now it's blatantly non-inclusive. And I've seen either of you mention that aspect of it. When 300 million people of the country are on a starvation diet, $2 and less, and that's the nationalism these guys are promoting at a blatant pace.
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, just on that particular point, right? I mean, which is to say that we should understand that in some ways that kind of majoritarian nationalism was not just, see, it was a project which was espoused with a certain single-mindedness, ideological, organizational consistency by the Sangh Parivar and its affiliates, right? But let's also not forget that, there were other political forces which gave them enough play to allow that to come. And I think even of the Congress party in its very late Indira Gandhi avatar, right? I mean, so in the first round in the late 60s, Indira Gandhi tries to outflank the left by going populist. In the second round, after seeing the power of the RSS in the emergency in 1977 and the Jan Sangh and so on, you try to outflank them from the right, yeah? And let's not forget that the 1984 victory of Rajiv Gandhi, which was the biggest ever victory, was a majoritarian mobilization on the back of the massacre of a minority in this city and other parts of India, right? So I wouldn't give all the credit only to sort of the BJP.
I would, building on what Srinath says, when you talk about the Congress as a mobilizational force, one of the ironies of this mobilization is precisely this. I remember after the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi in 1984, for the first time that I can or anybody could remember, there were advertisements designed by Rediffusion, to their eternal shame, which appeared in our newspapers on behalf of the Congress, which were sort of smartly copywritten. And I remember a particular slogan which said, "Chunauti nahi ek sandesh, mazboot hai haath, akhand hai desh." And it's important to understand that akhand is not a term that the Congress ever used. Akhand was straight out of the playbook of the Janasangh and later the Bharatiya Janata Party. These completely Goebbelsian acts passed by Indian states about, freedom of religion bills, anti-cow slaughter legislations. Many of them were first passed by Congress governments, provincial governments. So I don't think either Srinath or I are making the case that there's some Simon Pure pluralism. that it forms a Congress. We are saying that broadly speaking, the Congress's position is aggregatory, a kind of aggregating pluralism. After a while, it becomes a kind of cynical ploy and dynastic to boot. But the difference with, I think, right-wing majoritarianism is that majoritarianism is explicitly exclusionary, as you point out, of minorities. And for those who would say that, Mayawati famously used to say that they're both snakes, that the Congress is a white snake in green grass while the BJP is a green snake in green grass, or the other way around, I forget. But there is a difference, which is not to praise the Congress, but merely to distinguish between ideological differences. That even if we call the Congress hypocritical, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. And so it's a good thing when you have a hypocrisy that tries to pay lip service to pieties. When you get to a stage where you don't even need lip service, that's when you know you're in trouble. The gentleman here.
Sorry. I have a question for Srinath in the
Okay.
context of ABSPA. Two questions. One is, are there any other instances in the world where such a situation has arisen and a law has been drafted where the balance we spoke about has been achieved? A. And B, if a balanced law was brought about in India, what would it look like as opposed to what already is here? What safeguards do you think can be practically inserted to push it towards a balance, and perhaps something even the army would be comfortable with?
Well, so I really don't know the answer to the first question about other legal systems, because the only other parallel I can think about is Ireland, and even in Northern Ireland, the British actually, funnily enough, never used this kind of a legal sort of framework, right? So that is the only sort of instance I can think of, because you have to think also about legal systems which are somewhat comparable in that sense. The second question of saying, what are the kinds of safeguards that can legitimately be given, right? Which is a slightly different question from saying whether the army will actually accept it or not, right? So the first bit, what are the kinds of safeguards? I think a law which gives safeguards to the extent of saying that, listen, people will not be automatically sort of persecuted. If you're doing legitimate military activity, you cannot. But nevertheless, that if a prima facie sort of complaint is made, which can, after early investigation, be done, then the courts of law should be allowed to sort of take course. And instead of assuming that the default is to say that we will not allow prosecution, it should be that if a reasonable case has been made, as it was made in certain cases, and the CBI gave this thing in the context of at least one instance, then we have to sort of do that, right? I mean, so I think that sort of a compromise is there. And I'm not suggesting it. I mean, Jeevan Reddy Commission of 2005 came up with some very sensible proposals. The question is, what is acceptable to the army and what is not, right? Now, the army's view is that, listen, we are actually not interested in counterinsurgency and such like things at all, right? We are only supposed to be fighting Pakistan, China, or, preparing to fight someone else. You guys have gotten us into this game. And now that you've gotten us into this game, either you let us play the game in the rules by which work for us, or you get us out of it, right? And, it's striking to see how former chiefs of the Indian Army have given statements. Sitting chiefs have sort of given statements saying that, the removal of the FSPA cannot. And that, I think, is a more fundamental challenge to the way that we think about civil-military relations in a democratic context, right? See, because the military is a bit of an anomalous organization. It's not like the postal service, right? The military is the way that a state enforces its legitimate monopoly over violence, right? It's a very powerful institution. So which is why the way in which democratic control over the military is established is always asymmetric. It is asymmetric in a sense that to the military it might seem like it is not fair, but sorry, that's the way the game is going to be played, which is to say that your job is to do what the political leadership tells you. If there is a problem, i.e., if there are major sort of screw-ups along the way, then it is not for the military to sort of take the political leadership to task, but for the electorate to do that, right? So the chain of command is from the people to the politicians to the military, right? I mean, that's the way it's got to work. And I think there we are somehow fundamentally deviating from that particular norm of what I would imagine was actually quite well-established democratic practice. But here in India, we have a very, very disturbing situation on the FSPA, which frankly, I think even more than the human rights angle, from a longer-term perspective, I think it's very corrosive of democratic norms that we allow the military to say that they will determine what are the terms and conditions in which they will be employed. It's extraordinary. It can never happen in a democratic system. I mean, and there are examples of places where it's happened. There are other countries in our neighborhood where, we've seen what happens when the military sets its own terms of engagement.
The gentleman here, yes.
In the historical perspective, would you say that nationalism has been most successful and sustainable when it is generated on the basis of a positive symbol, say a positive movement, a positive idea, or when it has been generated in the context of the other, in terms of either an external enemy, in terms of the, a neighboring nation state which is unfriendly, or, a colonial state, as you pointed out, or when it is targeted or generated against an internal enemy, perceived internal enemy, like a migrant or an immigrant or a community or a caste. So when is it most likely to succeed and sustain itself?
I think the only answer to that question is a dark one, because if one thinks of anti-alien mobilizations as species of right-wing nationalism, there are spectacular successes. I mean, there's fascism, there's Germany in the early decades of the 20th century. So I think it would be fair to say that you can get that great mobilizations, great, very violent mobilizations are possible when.
I'd agree with you. I mean, in a sense that, it's very difficult to think of a nationalism which is kind of more positively oriented. I think thinking of it in more sort of benign or malign terms might be the sort of way to think about it. But also, I just wonder whether, we should think about modern politics entirely being encompassed by nationalism. I mean, why should that be the case? I mean, nationalism may be one, as you're saying, inescapable part, right? Because if progressive politics says that, listen, nationalism is not something we're going to touch, which especially if you say, look at certain kind of Western Marxists, right? I mean, for them, the mere word nationalism is redolent of Nazi Germany and such like things, right? So you don't want to sort of touch with the barge pole. But the fact is that in the context of a democratic nation state, if you vacate that space, then some other claimant to that mold of nationalism is going to come. But the alternative is not so much to say that, listen, we're not going to touch nationalism at all, but say that, listen, we stand for a certain, certain kind of nationalism which is more benign. But that has to be supplemented with various other visions, and that it cannot be simply a unitary sort of nationalism.
The political world is larger than.
And I think Indian nationalism, I mean, historically, I think it has been it's a many-voiced chorus. I mean, and it's those kinds of voices which have been constitutive of that nationalism. So in a sense, instead of thinking about it as in singular and a unitary project, that there are many strands to it, which may work, may not work.
The gentleman there.
How do you explain the phenomenon called Narendra Modi? Means, do you consider him a Hindu nationalist? Prime Minister.
Do I consider him as a Hindu nationalist? Yes, he says so himself. Are you asking that how do you explain this in the context of a mid-century project that was unlike Narendra Modi's? Sorry, how do you explain his success? Well, I mean, I think this is something that we were discussing. There was at one point in the discussion, Srinath spoke about how from the mid-70s onwards, you have a kind of mobilization. You have the RSS foregrounded in a way with a memory of heroic struggle. You have the experiments with the Janata Party, the coming out of the Janata Party, the attempt to both create a parliamentary party as well as a mobilization force. Late 80s, you must remember the large Ram Janmabhoomi, Babri Masjid agitation. I think broadly what we saw in when we talk about right-wing Hindutwadi nationalism, I think we see it operationalized as a campaigning project in the wake of one, Mrs. Gandhi's death and the events that followed, and B, also concurrently as a competitor with the box that VP Singh opened, the Mandal project. So So you essentially have a kind of large, both upper caste as well as, I mean, to the BJP's credit, it's broader than that.
Much broader.
I mean, much broader than that. But you did have a kind of galvanization in the late 1980s, and if one counts it as a success, the enormous mobilization that led to the raising of the Babri Masjid. The fact that the BJP, beginning with the late 1980s, coming into the 90s, through the 90s, it manages to plateau at about 20% of the vote. The Congress is moving in the opposite direction. It comes down and plateaus at about 23, 24, 25% of the vote. So I think the 90s are the great karma bhumi for the success of the BJP, the first NDA government. And I think if you're asking for a specific explanation of Narendra Modi's victory, I think this has to do in part with the reputation he built himself in Gujarat as a muscular leader who got things done. In part, one of his credentials was that he had a short way with sections of the population that didn't behave themselves. People talk about Donald Trump, but the interesting thing about Donald Trump is that he doesn't have Godra on his resume. The interesting thing about Mr. Modi is that when people speak of the fact that he was elected on an aspirational campaign where he essentially spoke of economic progress, I think I have some local disagreements with that description. He also spoke of the Pink Revolution. He also spoke about Bangladeshi Muslim migrants. But I think it's important to say that there's much that Mr. Modi could leave unsaid. That his credentials were set in stone before he actually campaigned for prime ministership. And I think you ask a very good and pointed question. The question still remains, and it's a question we should take seriously. Why 31% of the electorate voted for Mr. Modi? Why another 8% voted for his allies? Which totals up within a parliamentary system to nearly 40%. And it's a question that lots of us think about and produce partial answers to.
I mean, the only thing I'll say is that, you should not miss out on the, I'm not using the word in any sort of normative sense, but the kind of positive changes that the BJP made in order to be able to come to the stage where it has, right? Think about the embrace of what was traditionally an upper caste Hindi party of OBC leaders in states like Madhya Pradesh, right? Starting with
Kalyan Singh.
God. Yeah, Kalyan Singh. I mean, the fact that they don't have an OBC leader in UP is one of their main problems, right? Ever since Kalyan Singh left. But with Uma Bharti and Narendra Modi himself in this thing, right? So it's a party which kind of adapted to the new milieu. It was not just opposing Mandal, but also understood that this Mandal platform meant that you had to play the game in a very different way. It was a party which gave up its very old ideas of Swadeshi in economic terms and embraced and became ultimately a poster child of a certain model of liberal economic development, right? And again, that I think was not a foreordained thing. It had to be done. The party had to find ways of finding both the first and the succeeding generation of leaderships, right? I mean, between Vajpayee and Advani, that tango which they managed to do, where Vajpayee sort of Advani stepped back and allowed Vajpayee to do it. Similarly, the way in which after being out of power for 10 years and undergoing a huge amount of churning, a very powerful leader like Narendra Modi is thrown up by the party, I think also speaks to certain kinds of organizational strengths of the party and to the seriousness of its program, which have to be taken seriously. We don't have to agree with it, but it cannot be we have to understand that the BJP has enormously adapted to the new political circumstances of the post-1991 India, and that's what has given them a fighting chance.
Yes, the gentleman. I think.
I have two short questions. One is to take a slightly long-term view. Did partition fundamentally undermine the virtues of, what we call the pre-colonial Indian nationalism, which was based on diversity, which sort of legitimized Congress's compromises with secularism and other things, and then BJP defeated them at their own game? And the second question is, as Mukul said, that the Indian National Congress variety of nationalism was also about talking to the population that the British were economically exploiting us, and nationalism was associated with some kind of fundamental tangible gain. Now that everybody has sort of agreed to the economic reforms which we have had, so for the Congress it has become extremely difficult to kind of champion its own nationalism even in the post-independence period. And the Congress can talk about Nehru and all, but it can't tell the population that there are tangible gains in associating with that kind of nationalism. So how do you see these two things?
I think the point about about partition is very well taken. And one of the reasons why partition is such an enormous defeat for the Congress is because this entire notion of pluralism, where you claim that you represent diversity, when it's publicly demonstrated on this scale that for a very large section of the Muslims you don't, this is a kind of ideology-shattering defeat, because you're always vulnerable to the accusation that you pandered to them and look what you got, and there's always then the narrative about they got theirs, so why are we worrying about them now? So that's certainly true, that that this was certainly a body blow.
Yeah. So on the second question, right, which is the economic question, I think I agree. We sort of seem to live in a world where there is no alternative, right? In a sense that the sort of neoliberal, success is really capturing our minds and saying that isn't any alternative institutional form of capitalism which can be even tamed in certain ways is no longer really possible, and so on and so forth. But and again, but to give credit to at least the UPA-1 government, they did respond to certain kinds of pressures from below, right? Whether it was the sort of Forest Rights Act, whether it was in terms of the right to this thing, NREGA, and so on, which while the BJP initially scorned all of those things, has ultimately come around to embracing. So all I'm trying to say is that, and again, I mean, I fully agree with the point that the kind of social welfare programs those are fundamentally, in some ways, to use that overused word, neoliberal, right? Which is that they are not really about social mobilization. They are about making sure that you have a bank account to which the state will give you money, right? In a sense, it reinforces your individual identity rather than making you seem part of a larger sort of collective mobilization, right? So, but I agree that that is there. But even within those caveats, a project which says that, we will prioritize growth at the cost of every other desideratum within the sort of political economy space, and something else has to be, I think, distinguished. And I think one of the reasons the UPA-1 government went in was, and let's face it, people like Manmohan Singh were as much neoliberal and architects of these things as others were, but there were genuine sort of pressures from the ground. I mean, FRA particularly, I think, that there was a degree of mobilization which happened over a 25-year period, right? Started under Indira Gandhi, the first environmental agitations and so on, right? So, in a sense, I'd imagine that the space for popular politics still remains in certain ways. It may be marginal, but I still believe that in some ways it is there. So,
yes, the young man's been waiting for a while.
Since this talk was on nationalism, I missed parts of it here and there, but there was a lot of talk of India's diversity. And I noticed there were many references to political mobilization in South India, for example, and how it's distinct from North India. But one point I noticed, unless I possibly missed it, was that there was perhaps no reference to the Northeast to begin with. As to, Kashmir was referred to more than once, but the Northeast, which, in Assam at least, we had the national movement in some form with Gopinath Bodoloy and others. And even in Manipur, when the INA came in, there was some sort of association with Indian nationalism. And even the references to Muslims and Dalits were many, but Adivasis were referred to in passing with reference to the Forest Rights Act, or how the Hindu right under Deen Dayal Upadhyay tried to reach out to them. Which also brings me to another point. Should we presume that everyone on the Hindu right thinks alike and aligns with Savarkar's vision, and whenever any deviation is made, it's only a sugarcoating, or is there some genuine difference of opinion within that camp too, which can be actually examined? And two specific questions I had were pertaining to the land reforms of Nehru. It was mentioned time and again that Nehru didn't institutionalize land reforms. It was referred to again and again, and Sheikh Abdullah did, and it happened in Kerala. But Nehru tried to amend the constitution to actually push for land reforms. Whether or not they were entirely successful may have varied from region to region because of the challenges he had. But should we not give him credit for actually trying to institutionalize land reforms to start with? I mean, Sheikh Abdullah aligned with Nehru only because they shared a land reforms vision, among other things. Also, another question I had was, Mr. Srinath mentioned specifically that Ram Manohar Lohia, other than his caste agitation, he also had a vision in terms of Hindi versus English and some kind of a vision of how India should fit into the international order. I wanted to know more about what was Lohia's international vision for India. And lastly, when we talk about the victory of Mr. Modi, this is the last point, if we talk about the victory of Mr. Modi, then I think the corruption of the Congress and the frustration that people had with the Congress was a major factor. Plus, when we talk of right-wing politics, what about the Muslim right-wing politics that we see in Malda or with Azam Khan in Muzaffarnagar or in the Azad Maidan in Mumbai, and how that boosts Hindu majoritarianism? So I think that aspect is often neglected in the discourse. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Very quickly, because I think we are...
We'll literally go over the entire conversation again.
Yeah, so we'll... So very quickly, you said the Northeast, I think. I'll just take that one. Look, when we were discussing AFSPA, I wanted to mention the fact that I teach in Jamia, and we had a conference in the Northeastern Center there, and there was a session, to my astonishment, and this says more about me than the subject, about AFSPA literature. So the Northeast actually has a genre of literature entirely centered on AFSPA. I mean, it so completely, in a sense, encompasses the lives of many states in the Northeast that, and I think it's appropriate for you to to chasten us about the complete absence of the Northeast. I suppose our only defense would be that discussions like this can't be completely encyclopedic, but it's important to actually name check that, and thank you for that. Nehru and land reforms, I think the thing is that if you're in power for 17 years, you get credit for what you do.
Yeah, exactly. And, I don't know, I mean, Mukul, maybe you should answer this question about Muslim politics in India post-partition.
Yeah,
right? I mean, I have a very sort of superficial observation, which you may want to...
I think the point you make about the fact that when we use categories like right and left, in liberal conversations, you elide what right-wing Muslim politics does. So, for example, I remember the grotesque incident when Taslima Nasreen was physically bullied in Hyderabad by Owaisi. You mentioned Azam Khan. I think there are a couple of reasons for the absence of discussion. One is the discreditable one, which is or one that's not completely thought through, where you decide that since the Hindu right is a larger menace to a plural or secular space, so this is the principal enemy. But as you point out, this is not a conversation. You can't have a conversation about sharecroppers without talking about landlords. I mean, there's a kind of relationship between the two, and we need to close both ends of the circle. So that's certainly true.
So, I mean, just to pick up on the first question which you asked, which is about Hindu nationalism as an ideology and whether people are still... I don't think so at all. I think it has evolved. It has conditioned itself to various changes in Indian politics. It has found new sort of idioms of expression, new ways of conveying points, which I think are very important. I mean, to assume that somehow you can go back and just read Savarkar and understand. I mean, Savarkar is essential starting point, but that's hardly the sort of finishing point of that conversation. And I think, the part of the problem with, even for historians and others, is that because most historians are by definition sort of progressive, left, and liberal, and so on, you just don't want to take this as an intellectual project seriously. I mean, I'm yet to find a good intellectual biography of Savarkar, who was a very complicated man, incidentally, right? I mean, who had many facets to him. And, or say someone like Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. I think part of our problem is our inability to take it seriously in its own terms. And that is something that I think we need to work on.
If you're interested, there is an interesting book by Christopher Bailey on the intellectual history of India in the 19th and 20th centuries called Recovering Liberties, which treats Indian political leaders, especially in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, not merely as people teleologically rushing towards independence or partition, but as thinkers on their own right, who are trying to think their way through within a broad frame of what he describes as liberalism, but trying to think about representation and the individual and the community in interesting ways.
Yeah, I know Savarkar was the president of the Bombay Atheist Society, incidentally.
That's right. There you go. So should we...
Can I have one question?
Yes, please.
Just as a counter to what Srinath said. Now, while you did mention that that the right wing has evolved beyond Savarkar, but given enough time and distance, let's say another 20 years, and the, let's say, rise of possibly another strong man, and they say that, no, he's the totem that I want to hang on to, right? And and the books and the stuff that was written around that time are the Bible that we want to kind of live with. And I want to discard everything else that kind of happened in between. Do you think that's a possibility? It's a sort of a regress, I know, but do you think that's a possibility that it could always happen? Because it has happened in many religions that way. There was a reformatory period, and then there was a kind of snap back into saying that my book is the final. And
Sure. I mean, I see it more as fundamentally a political project, right? Which is what it was from the very beginning. In a sense, the cultural nationalist idiom should not obscure the fact that it was fundamentally a political project from the word go, right? And in that sense, like all politics, it has to respond to situation. Harold Macmillan used to say that politics, events do matter, right? I mean, you cannot sort of continue doing the same things in various contexts. But to give credits to the Hindu right in India, they have managed to maintain a consistency of core ideological vision, which I think is quite impressive in the context that, in Indian politics, other ideologies particularly have kind of mellowed or faded and so on. Whereas they've sort of held on to it, found new ways of adapting it to situations. And I think their economic program is a very good example, right? I mean, in a sense, even today, if you speak to people in the Swadeshi Jagran Manch and so on, they might be unhappy about this or that aspect of what is happening. But the fact is that, the Sangh as a whole has kind of moved on and understood that, this is the new idiom in which you will have to sort of capture power and sort of, articulate your policies and so on. And I think that is, suggests a certain vitality to that tradition, which should never be underestimated. And the flip side to it is, of course, that, when they have power, they will try and put in their agenda. And I don't see why anyone should grudge them the opportunity to do so.
Just as an appendix to that, I think it's important, both parts of what Srinath said are important. One is the fact of the adaptability of the Sangh and its impressive case study in political development. But the fact that this adaptability always takes place within a framework which cannot change. I mean, your essential ideological commitments are to a majoritarian nationalism. That is your bottom line, which actually affords them extraordinary clarity. They know where they can they can compromise or change their positions. But the ultimate object is a kind of majoritarian exclusionary nationalism. And I think it's important here to say that the reason why, in a sense, we are here is because the history of South Asian nationalism, or the history of South Asian majoritarianism, whether it's Sri Lanka or currently Burma or Pakistan or Bangladesh, is that majoritarianism is not something to be avoided as a kind of optional extra. Majoritarianism creates republics where essentially you argue that there's an organic citizenry that belongs to the community that owns the state. And the others may well have full rights, but they live at the grace and favor of this organic community. And second-class citizenship or a second-class status in, say, the Ottoman Empire didn't matter very much because, there were no rights as such in any case. But second-class status within a republic or second-class citizenship is absolutely intolerable. It's not a stable condition. That if you look at the history of South Asia, if you look at Sri Lanka, this magical island, which is like a case study of pluralism till the late 1950s, chooses to go down the majoritarian route and has 30 years of civil war. Because the whole point about majoritarian nationalism is that it's fundamentally unstable and it invariably leads to violence and civil war.
Yeah, and I think the Sri Lankan example is also important in a slightly different way, right? Which is to say that once you allow for a certain kind of core universal citizenship to be diluted, then recapturing that ground for this or that other cause is going to be difficult, right? And here I think particularly of the plantation Tamils who were disenfranchised in Sri Lanka. At that point of time, the Sri Lankan Tamils did say nothing, right? They were happy to sort of for these guys to be disenfranchised. But when their turn came, then it became something different, right? So the point is that norms of civic republicanism, if you are going to sort of allow it to be diluted, then it's going to come back and have longer-term consequences for all of us.
Thank you, Srinath.
No, I think...
Thank you for coming.
Oh, sorry, someone else. Go.
Thank you, Mukul, and thank you, Srinath, for such an illuminating conversation. It has brought many perspectives to us, and most importantly, it makes us stop and think. I'm sure the audience will agree on this as well. On the behalf of Indus Syndicate, I, Shivani, would like to thank Mukul and Srinath for agreeing to do this talk and helping us learn so much. I also thank India International Center for helping us in organizing this or for being such gracious hosts. Thank you especially to Pramola Ghosh. Thank you all the friends of Indus Syndicate who helped set this up, especially Chirag Patnaik, who took out time from his busy schedule and made this happen. And thank you to all the dear audience who had come today and asked so many questions today and made this session more and more interactive. I really thank you all for all of this. And lastly, please follow Indus Syndicate on Twitter and Facebook to know more about any upcoming event that we may hold. Thank you. Thanks a lot.